Hello, I'm Kate Blood and I'm your webinar chair today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners of all the lands wherever we're meeting from today. For my participation, I'm sitting in Beaufort in Western Victoria, Australia, and this is the land of the Wathaurong people. I'd like to extend my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and any other elders who are joining us today. We recognise that there are many traditional owners caring for country, including weed and fire management activities, and some of these practices play a key role in continuing their culture. I'd like to welcome you today on behalf of myself, Kate Blood, and my colleague Bianca Gold, who's based in Horsham, and our many collaborators. Welcome. Today is the last of our 4 webinars in this series, and it's fantastic to be here today. Bianca and I are part of the Weeds at the Early Stage of Invasion team, which is part of the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. We're hosting today through the statewide Integrated Flora and Fauna teams, or SWIFT website, and want to thank SWIFT for all their support in running these webinars and hosting the series online. We're also proud members of the Weed Society of Victoria, one of our many other collaborators. Our tech support today is Matt Bliss with Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Thanks, Matt. And we acknowledge our collaborators through the many logos on our material that we might be using today and promoting the event. For those of you who haven't logged in to previous webinars in this series, it takes a big team to run such a series. It's quite a production, and we just want to make mention of a number of people who've helped us along the way. Andrew Geschke from DELP's Connecting Communities program for great support, particularly early on, and many of the images and connecting slides that we're using. The many regional staff from DELP's Natural Environment Program and also the Forest Fire and Regions Group. Mal Corrie from DELP's Weeds and Pests on Public Land Program. Thanks, Mal, for supporting the WESI project and our ability to run these webinars. Our Parks Victoria colleagues and particularly our supervisor, Stefan Kaiser. The webinars cover many different aspects of weed management after fire, and it's relevant for planned burns as well as wildfires. So across the series, we've had over 1,400 registrations from all over the world, which to us is just amazing that there's so much interest in this topic. If you're using social media today, please use the hashtag WeedFireWebinars. We'd love you to tag us, let us know what you're doing, how you might be applying the information you're learning. If you have any questions or comments during the webinar today, please put them in the chat on the side of your Teams meeting screen. If you're joining us through the live YouTube link, periodically there'll be an email address appearing on your screen and you can send questions to that email address. So at the end of each presentation, Bianca will read out the questions and we'll be able to get the presenters to answer them. We've got 3 presentations today and we'll be finished by 12:15. Very importantly, the webinars have been made possible through funding from the Victorian Government's $22.5 million Bushfire Biodiversity Response and Recovery Program. That's shortened to BBRR, so you might be hearing that a few times today. So that's the Bushfire Biodiversity Response and Recovery Program. So that's a fab program that's going on and into the future. Now, it's a bit unusual today. I actually get to introduce our team. I'm Kate Blood and my colleague Bianca Gold. We're going to be tag teaming today. So it's our pleasure to bring the first presentation, which is all about environmental weed recognition after fire and taking better photos with a mobile device. So we are part of the Weeds at the Early Stage of Invasion project, and we are with the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. So I'm just going to open my presentation. We're based in Victoria in southeastern Australia, and I'll be focusing on environmental weed recognition. So our project, I guess Bianca and I are enablers. We are supporting public land and biodiversity managers all over Victoria with managing early invader weeds. And so we produce tools, we run workshops, we're active on social media, we provide support and engagement to help the people on the ground making those decisions and doing the work do it more effectively. So our project's been running since 2011, and normally at this time of year we're doing face-to-face weed identification workshops, and well, this year here we are doing a webinar online and reaching much further than just Victoria, so that's a fabulous thing. We have been encouraged to support bushfire recovery. So that's one of the main themes, of course, of this webinar is bushfire recovery. So let's just talk briefly about some of the tools that our project has developed. A lot of the work that we do is based around a decision-making framework, and it's just 6 simple steps that help people make logical decisions about which weeds to manage and which early invaders actually are early invaders and what to do about them. So it's all described in a summary form in our early invader manual, which is available online, and through the webinar we'll put links in the chat section so you can follow those up later, and they'll also be provided on the Swift website. So the 3 main things that we wanted to just mention today that should be in your toolkit if you're dealing with any environmental weeds after fire is, I guess they revolve around the post-fire weeds triage manual, and it's a really great place to go if you want to make decisions about which weeds you're going to treat. And if you use that manual in combination with the early invader manual, which I mentioned before, and also the advisory list of environmental weeds in Victoria, it can give you a really good way of prioritising which weeds to deal with after fire. And it can be really overwhelming, we understand that. So there's some really good tools that we encourage you to have a look at. So a lot of us have been working from home this year and haven't been able to get out in the field. So we thought we'd take you on a bit of a trip. And we're going to start from the top of Victoria and we're going to end up down at the coast. So there were so many weeds to choose from today that we've settled on some common and also some early invader weeds, and we're just hoping that by the end of our session, even the hardened, well-experienced weed practitioners, hopefully there'll be at least one weed in this session that you haven't seen before or you don't know much about. So let's have a look at what we're going to see on our little trip and take you through the trip guide. So this is going to be a typical screen, an example, and I just wanted to tell you about what we'll be looking at. So along the top of the screen will be the common and botanical names. To the right-hand side, there's a map of distribution from Vic Flora, and then another one from the Atlas of Living Australia underneath, showing a broader picture of distribution records. Now, I've got to say here that it's really important that you don't believe the maps completely, in terms of many people don't record weeds. So chances are there will be lots more dots that should be on the map that aren't there, and that's a really important point to make today, is that it's really important to record weed distribution. So I encourage you to do that whenever possible. Then if we continue down on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a little line there from the post-fire weeds triage manual about just a generalization of what priority this weed might be after fire, and also the type of weed it is. So for this example, it's a mat perennial, and generally it's a high priority after fire. Then to the bottom right-hand side of the screen is a little arrow with the risk rating and a score, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. Now, all the images in this presentation are taken by myself, and if there are others that are taken by other people, there will be an acknowledgement in the text underneath or next to the photograph, just so that it's clear where the image has come from. And I really want to thank all the people who've been contributing and sharing photographs with me in the recent weeks. I'm sorry I can't show all of them. It's been fascinating to see what's going on out in the field. Okay, so just another thing before we go on. We're not talking about treatment detail today. We just don't have the time, but hopefully we'll have some links in the on the website soon. And I can't teach you how to be botanists today, so it's really about some general recognition using these photographs to help you recognise them. Okay, so just briefly, this is the risk rating score range. So to the left of the arrow is 0, and to the right is the highest risk rating, which is 33.3, using the advisory list of environmental weeds in Victoria, just so that the further to the right, the higher the number, the worse the potential risk is of that weed. That's just to help you with that little arrow down in the bottom right of your screen. Okay, so let's start in the high country. Now, the highest point in Victoria is 1,986 metres, and that's at the top of Mount Bogong in the fantastic Victorian high country, one of my favourite parts of the state. So let's have a look at some examples of environmental weeds, high priority environmental weeds in the high country. Now, something that's so common all over the state, and including the high country, it's a very common weed, is sheep sorrel, and from Europe. And here are some recent photos of what it's doing post-fire in parts of New South Wales and also on Mount Buffalo. So it's got underground stolons, it's a moderately high risk, lots of it around, and it's very quick to emerge after fires. Something I wanted to make you aware of is oxeye daisy, Leucanthemum vulgare. Our colleague in New South Wales, Keith McDougall, has been flying the flag for keeping on top of this weed. It just can explode after fire. This is some aerial shots from Kosciuszko National Park, and it seeds and also has these little creeping rhizomes and spreads out quite quickly. It's a perennial, so once it gets established, it can be very difficult to get on top of. So if you've just got small patches of this emerging in new areas, it's a really good idea to try and get rid of it before it becomes well and truly entrenched. Now, this one is the lodgepole pine, or also known as shore pine, because it also grows down on the coast. This is Pinus contorta, and the interesting thing about this pine is that when it falls over, it can actually take root from the stems. So this is at Falls Creek, where it was grown as in an arboretum, a test area for growing introduced trees. And when it gets weighted down with the snow, it falls over, and then the stems can take root. It also spreads by seeds, and it's under active management at Falls Creek. It could also be an issue on the coastline. So there aren't many records of it in Victoria, and we'd like to keep it that way. It's a very high risk tree. Now we're looking at a grass. This is called creeping fog, or creeping soft grass, Holcus mollis. If you're familiar with Yorkshire fog, which is very common, this is another in that group of grasses. This one, Holcus mollis, has underground root a really thick matted root system and spreads underground also by seed. It has rapid growth. It spreads hundreds of square metres very quickly and excludes other things growing around it. It's from Europe. It has been used to stabilise high country areas in association with ski fields, and there's quite a bit of concern that it's going to become a major issue up in that area. This photograph is from Falls Creek in 2016. So again, a very high risk, and not many sites recorded yet in Victoria. Okay, let's have another look at another plant for the high country, another weed. This is mountain or perennial cornflower. If you're familiar with the regular cornflowers that you get at the florist, this is a relative of that, Centaurea montana. This is a perennial form of plant. This photograph at the top is taken at Falls Creek. It's obscured by some sheep sorrel, but it has been grown in gardens at Falls Creek and has been spreading out of gardens within the Falls Creek village. There is only one record in the system for it naturalised in Victoria at Falls Creek, and the photo on the left from the website is Wildflower, is of the flower. So it's very attractive. It's been grown for gardening in Victoria, available for trade. And my concern is that because it's so well adapted from Europe to, minus 20 degrees centigrade, growing in those kind of conditions and very variable situations, the seed and also its creeping rhizome, its underground stem, makes it, I think, a high risk for our high country. So it'd be really great to not let it get established. Okay, now we're moving a bit down slope to the in between the high country and the coast, which is a very, very broad area with so many different vegetation communities. And I have to say that a lot of the species I'm talking about today could grow anywhere from the high country to the coast. I'm just trying to categorise them for the ease of the presentation, but be aware that they're not just necessarily limited to those areas that I might be mentioning them in. So we're looking at the in-between area now, and this is English broom, Cytisus scoparius, very common weed in Victoria and in the bushfire impacted areas. Not so many records for East Gippsland and down to the coast, but it is growing in similar situations elsewhere in Victoria. So I just want to make sure that it's not spreading into those new areas, although I know there's a lot of active work going on for English broom already in the bushfire impacted areas. East Gippsland, CMA, Parks Victoria and so on are doing a big amount of work to try and keep this weed under control. So this shrub from Europe, it can fling seeds from its seed pods 4.5 metres away. The seeds are washed downstream, downslopes, spread by contaminated vehicles, all sorts of ways that these plants are spread. So the seeds in the soil under established English broom, there can be 50,000 seeds per square metre in the soil, and they can survive for years sitting in the soil. And after a fire, you can have a lot of germination of that particular weed. Okay, the next one is bone seed, Chrysanthemoides monolifera subspecies monolifera. It's an old favourite of mine. It's something I've had contact with since my childhood, helping my mum pull out bone seed seedlings when we went bird watching in the Yuyangs. I've known it most of my life, and it's a pretty amazing plant from South Africa. The soil seed bank under bone seed plants, 2,500 metres, 2,500 seeds per square metre under the plants, and those seeds can be 13% viable still after 3 years, and can still be viable 10 years in the soil. So very common in parts of the state, less common over in Gippsland, and I just want to alert you that it can be very difficult to get rid of if you have it arriving in new areas. So let's have a look at some of the heaths, some of the Erica species. There's just 3 of many of them. These are typically from Europe. The pink one on the left is Erica bacans. The one in the middle is Erica lusitanica Spanish heath, and the one on the right is Erica arborea, the tree heath. Now, the Spanish heath and tree heath are often confused and incorrectly recorded. There's subtle differences, but one of the key features is if you've got a lens to look at the hairs on the stems of the tree heath, and they've got little branches on them. But once you get your eye in, they are quite easy to tell apart. But for the new player, can be quite confusing. They are spreading near and far around Victoria, and if they're new to your area, I really encourage you to get rid of them. Particularly Spanish heath has underground stems, and it suckers if it's burnt off, and has prolific seed. Himalayan honeysuckle, Lycisteria formosa, is a shrub from the Himalayas and China, and it forms really dense thickets. It can grow up to 3 meters high, and these pendulous clusters of flowers have little purple fruit, and each fruit can produce 50 to 100 seed, and there are hundreds of fruit on a plant. And deer are one of the common vectors. They like the fruit, and foxes, other animals, also spread it. Stems that fall over can take root and spread that way. Normally over winter it drops its leaves and dies back, but sometimes it can grow through. Very high risk, and really important to stay on top of that weed. Now, this is the only Australian species that I've included today. This is from Western Australia, West Australian bluebell creeper. Ballardiera fusiformis is the current name. It's also been called Ballardiera heterophylla, Solia heterophylla. So from Western Australia, it's been grown widely in gardens, and it's got these fruit, little maggot-shaped fruit that are turned black when they're ripe, full of seed, and the birds, foxes, carry them out of gardens and off they go. And we are seeing this going nuts all over Victoria. Very common now, seeing it in bushland, and it will invade into undisturbed bushland. So really important to stay on top of this one, because it is very difficult to get rid of once it's established. Now, the aquatic plant Amazon frogbit, Limnobium laevigatum, it's a floating aquatic plant, and it's not actually recorded in Vic Flora, although it has been found at various sites around Melbourne, Gembrook, and also Bairnsdale in Gippsland. It's an early invader. It's been used as a pond plant, and there are big concerns for its ability to take over wetland areas. There have been active eradication programs in New South Wales and more recently in Victoria. It's not in the advisory list either, so really important to get familiar with that one. And if you see something that looks like it, let us know, and we might be able to help you with its identification. Okay, now we've got a couple of perennial grasses. This one is called perennial veld or velt grass. It's Ehrhata calycina. If you were in webinar 1, you would have heard Judy Fisher talking about this grass. It's a perennial from South Africa, and it's got underground rhizomes or stems, and it also spreads by seed. It's common, particularly like sandy areas, and I reckon it would do very well in parts of Gippsland, but it also grows inland as well. The next one is African lovegrass, Eragrostis curvula, and it's already established in parts of Gippsland, and I think it's got a lot of potential to go further. Around Victoria, over the last 20 years, I've seen it exploding along roadsides where it gets spread by slashes. And talking to South Australian colleagues, they say that's what happened in South Australia. It moved along roadsides, and then from there it spread into natural vegetation and farming land big time, and they've got big issues there, and we've got big issues here as well. So don't underestimate African lovegrass. It's got a lot further to go in Victoria. There were so many grasses I could have chosen today. I settled on these two. Now let's have a look at a couple of the opuntioid cacti. These are two opuntia species, and the thing that we find is people think all cactus are called prickly pear and they're all the same thing, and we're here to tell you they're not. I think there's over 27 species established in Australia now, and many of them are already in Victoria naturalised. These are just two species for today. The top two photographs are called drooping prickly pear, Opuntia monacantha, and the bottom left is wheel cactus, Opuntia robusta. There aren't many records, but we know they're both very common now in Victoria. The two maps there are just for Opuntia monacantha, and we know there are more infestations in Gippsland than the maps indicate, and they're under active management. So these two are moving in Gippsland, and if you're familiar with them in your area, don't just ignore them, because they never go away. They will just keep increasing. Birds, foxes carry the fruit. Those stems can live for, in a box here in the office for 2 years, no water, and I could put them on the ground tomorrow and they would root and continue to grow. So incredibly drought tolerant. Gazania, we couldn't not include Gazania. There's a couple of species, Gazania linearis and Gazania rigans. They're such incredible, cheery weeds. I guess if you have to work with weeds, may as well be beautiful ones. These are from South Africa. They are a perennial plant. So once they're growing, they will continue growing, and they spread prolifically by seed. They're carried along roadsides by slashes and just the wind from trucks and so on. And they are going nuts in Victoria. We see them from one end of the state to the other now. Nowhere near as many records on the map as there should be. And they're a very high threat because they will move into native grasslands, woodlands, and they just take up space. So people are planting them deliberately still because they're so beautiful and drought tolerant, but at their peril because they've got a lot further to go. Okay, the next one is Periwinkle, Vinca major. This incredible plant from the Mediterranean, 40 kilometres along, I think it's the Tambo River in Gippsland, both sides of the river, just solid carpet of it. It's got a lot further to go, a very high risk. Okay, we're moving into the coastal area now, so I just wanted to talk about a few species. Red ink weed, Phytolacca octandra. These photos, the two on the left, are from the Friends of Malakuta, who've been doing a lot of work on it. Two different photos of the same area with the generation after the fire. Prolific cedar, it's often called an ephemeral, a fire ephemeral. It comes up prolifically after fire, and then it tends to disappear as other vegetation takes over, but the seed will persist in an area and germinate again after the next fire event. Dolichos P, Dipogon lignosus from South Africa, pink or white flower, a climber. It's also called dunny creeper climber because it covered the old dunnies in backyards. It does a good job covering bushland as well. This photo on the left is in the Wingan Inlet littoral rainforest after fire in October. Mass germination of seeds. So it's a very high threat to bushland areas. A shrub, this is myrtle leaf milkwort, Polygala myrtifolia. Again, prolific cedar, and not many dots on the map for Gippsland, but I reckon it's got a lot of potential in Gippsland, so don't ignore it if you find it in your area. Something you will be familiar with on coastal sand dunes is sea spurge, Euphorbia pirealius, from the Mediterranean and Eurasia. It has buoyant seeds that can float for 8 years on coastal water, salt water, and the seeds can be 50% viable still after 2 years just floating in seawater. Incredibly tough. It's moving further and further along Victoria's coastline. This one is coastal or coast gladiolus, Gladiolus guinzii. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Now, it's common on the New South Wales coast, but there's only recently, since about, I don't know, early 2000s, that it's been recorded in Victoria around Malakuta. And Al Trumbull-Ward told me that it spread 5 to 6 kilometres along the coast in 3 years. So it can be confusing when it's not in flower. It looks like some of the grasses growing on the coast. It's got little cormals that can float on sea current, and they're buoyant in seawater for many months and just keep moving, being spread along the coast with currents. So don't ignore it if you find that one. That's at the early stage of invasion and a very high risk. Sicilian sea lavender, Limonium hyblaeum, is a big problem over in the west of Victoria along the coastline, where it's come from South Australia. And if it's not in Gippsland already, I'd be surprised. But if you haven't got it and you find it, don't delay, do something about it, because it's a perennial cushion-shaped bush, produces thousands of seeds, grows on sand dunes, rocky boulder coast, salt marsh, and it has rhizomes as well as seed. Don't ignore it. It's only a small plant, but gee, it has big impacts, as you can see from these photos around Port Fairy. Coast capeweed, Untitled populifolia. You're probably familiar with the annual capeweed. This is a perennial one, this one, and it's been spreading from New South Wales and South Australia into Victoria. I'm sure it's more common than the distribution records find, but it is in around Malakuta, and there's been a lot of work being done in the southwest of the state now. It takes over sand dunes. So again, from South Africa, don't ignore it. Do something about it. So I guess in closing, before I hand over to Goldie, is if in doubt, don't pull it out or spray it. Wise words from Graham Lorimer recently reminding me that make sure you confirm your identification before you do treatment, and also delimit. That's work out the boundary of your infestation before you invest thousands of dollars in treating. And that's something that our speaker, Randall Robinson, will talk about more today. And also it's really important to record your distribution, which Dale Fuller will talk about after Bianca does. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Bianca Gold, my lovely colleague, who I enjoy working with so much, talking about taking better photos with a mobile device. Over to you, Bianca.
Thanks, Kate. Before I get into it, I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners and the lands wherever we join the webinar from today. For me, I'm participating in Horsham, Victoria. This is the land of the Watchabolik, the Jabwa, the Jabajali, the Wagaya and the Jopagulk peoples. So why take photos of weeds? They are just a weed. Why would we want nice photos of them? You may have come across a plant out in the field that you're not sure what it is, but you'd like to know what it is. You might be planning to find this out yourself, or you might want someone else to help you with it. Perhaps you know what it is and it's a real baddie, in which case it would be good to have some good photos for raising awareness, maybe on social media or in a newsletter. Perhaps you know what it is and you have funding for that species and need to report on it. Or maybe it's just wanting to record presence for the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas or other database. Kate has a good saying, it's easy to take crap shots and not that much harder to take good ones. So today I'll give you some tips in getting better photos of weeds, and particularly for ID purposes. So what do you need to photograph? Surely a few metres away is good enough. Weed people are experts and they know what they're looking at. But what helps identify a plant? Is it the whole plant? Is it just the flowers? Maybe it's the bark texture or the trunk colour. Maybe it's other parts that have significant features. Well, in reality, it could be all of these things. When you combine them together, you've painted a picture of what the whole plant looks like. And here's how. Let's firstly start with context. Taking a photo of the weed in the environment or landscape that it is in provides context of where the plant is growing, the conditions it's growing in, and what else it's growing around it. Taking a photo of the whole weed provides context of the plant's growth habit and shape. It can help determine whether it is a shrub, a tree, a climber, or something else. But this on its own might not be enough to identify the plant or show someone what the plant is. So let's take a closer look at some other plant parts that can help with this. You need to get up close and personal with your weed here. Leaves can be different shapes, colours, sizes. They can have serrated edges, smooth edges. They can taper to a point. They have veins that form intricate patterns both above and underneath the leaf. They can be smooth, rough, hairy, different colours and textures on the upper to the underside. They can change from juvenile and seedlings to adult forms. In some cases, like this English holly, the leaves of the lower part of the plant are spiky, typical of what we find on our Christmas decorations. Whereas further up, where the animals can't chomp them, they are smoother edged. The leaves on the bridal creeper Western Cape form are much larger than that of its relative. Don't be afraid to include something for scale, such as Mitch Williams' thumb. Leaves may even mean the difference between species, so it pays to take a few seconds to capture these. Flowers are attractive. They're usually what draws us to a plant in the first place. Flowers come in all different colours, shapes, sizes, and some even have all sorts of fancy details. This is a really good identifying feature. So if your weed has flowers, take a moment to get some good close-up shots. You might need to rummage around on the ground for this one, so be prepared to get down low. If none are present on the plant at the time, check around the base of the plant to see if there's any fallen seeds, seed capsules, or maybe there's leftovers of some fruit or berries. Plants like this firethorn produce clusters of yellow berries, whereas the sweet Osteospermum on the right have bunches of orange berries with glossy, sticky seeds inside, as you can see here. By having a good, clear, close-up photo, you can easily see the difference between these two. Other plants can produce distinctive cones or sacs, like the contorta pine and swan plant. Taking the time in the field to notice these details can save you a ton of time when you're back in the office or at home. Be careful getting too close to this one, it could be a little risky. We should not forget other features of the weed. This could be the bark, the colouring of the stems or trunks, and even the thorns or spines. Some plants, like this cork oak, have interesting textured bark, and being a big tree, it is hard to get photos of leaves or other parts, unless they have fallen to the ground or have low-hanging branches. The firethorn and the Hudson pear are both spiny, which may help to identify them. It's important to remember the base of the plant too. This is especially relevant for grasses, bulbs, and even aquatics. Please do not dig up any plants unless you are certain that they are a weed. You can photograph the base without pulling them out of the ground, although that is what we have done here, and you can scrape away a bit of the dirt if you need to get the top of a bulb or base of a grass. For aquatics, you can take a clear vessel and holding it very carefully with the lip just above the water surface, you can submerge your mobile phone in it and take a photo as if you were in the water. Make sure to have the camera setting ready before doing this. It can require a bit of skill, so be careful not to drop either the vessel or the phone in the drink, or you might end up with a soggy mobile phone. And when you put them all together, you get something like this. You can see here by having the close-ups as well as the distance shots for context, You paint the picture of what the plant looks like, and you also give the detail you need to identify what it is. Another example of painting the picture is this giant reed. Some distant photos for context, some close-ups of the leaf joint and a rhizome of the base of the plant, from the base of the plant. This collection of Valerian pics makes for easy identification. You can see here the environment that it is growing in, along with a good photo of the shape and growth habit. And finally, some photos of the flowers to really confirm the ID. If there's colour variations at the same site, it's important to capture these. The Valerian is a good example of a plant that can flower in varying colour shades from pink right through to white. And as mentioned earlier, leaves can be different on plants, so it's good to capture a variety of those. What else do you need to think of when you're photographing weeds? Well, it's good to have your location settings on, as this will geotag your photo and make for easier location recording later. You may wish to use a tripod for stability, like the one pictured here. This one is flexible, it can bend around things, and it's also magnetic for sticking to metal surfaces such as your vehicle. But don't forget to take it off before you drive off. Also, your mobile device has a video camera setting. Videoing can help show different angles and underside of flowers and leaves. Ensure your photos are in focus, light is suitable, and the angle at which you are taking it show a clear and easily viewable photo of the plant in question. Here are some examples of photos that could have turned out better just by taking a few seconds to capture them. The first photo on the left is out of focus, meaning the details of the plant are blurry and hard to define. The second photo on the right has clear focus and better light. You can see both sides of the leaf, and the leaf edges and berries are more clearly. Another example here shows that the photo on the left is in shadow, which is from the person taking it, and the flower is out of focus, making it blurry and hard to see. The photo on the right is the same plant in the same location with good light, no shadow, and the flower in focus. You can even see the hairs on the stem more clearly. So just by taking a few extra moments, you've got a much clearer image. In this example, you can see the first photo is on an angle. The trees and the tennis court in the background show this. The plant in question at the front is out of focus also. The second photo on the right is of a better angle. You can tell by the tree trunks in the background, and the plant in question is in better focus. So hopefully you can see in this quick tips and tricks that by taking some extra time and a few extra photos, it's worth it in the end. Some additional things to help out with your ID besides your favourite weedy friend is the Wesy Early Invader Manual and the Wesy Guide number 2, Looking for Weeds, Name and Notify. There's some great tips and information in those documents about photographing and identifying weeds. The Weeds of the Southeast is a great book for helping with ID. It has a fantastic section at the front where you can look at plants up by the colour of their flower, and it's actually what I use to identify the Cape honeysuckle that you featured in an earlier slide. There's also plenty of mobile apps available. This one, Seek by iNaturalist, is free. Kate and I have tested this one in our last training trip, which was sort of in this time last year, and we were quite impressed with the results. It's a handy tool to either ID or point you towards possible options. And if you're into the Insta and other social media like Facebook, Twitter, and for the DELP staff out there, Yammer, these are great places to seek help in identifying a weed, especially if you have good photos to share, which you should be able to do after seeing this presentation today. Thank you for listening and attending the webinar today. And if you've attended the previous 3 in the series, I would like to take this opportunity to mention the Bushfire Biodiversity Response and Recovery Program for funding this webinar series, the Weeds and Pests on Public Land Program who fund the Wesy project, the Wesy Steering Group, Friends of Wesy, and our manager Stefan Kaiser, who's always very supportive. We hope you have a safe and happy festive season. And now, Kate, do we have time for questions?
We do indeed. We've got a few minutes available.
Fabulous. I did see one question, which was, why are some of these invasive plants sold in nurseries?
Good question. Many of our environmental weeds started out as garden plants, and they've escaped from gardens, carried by the wind, by birds, foxes, down drainage lines, and so on. And so, yes, garden plants are a common source of environmental weeds, and many are still traded in nurseries, garden centres, online, swapped between family members and friends. So there has been a lot of work done about this over decades now, and it's a lot better than it used to be. And still, we've got a lot of ground that we could work through. Department of Jobs, DJPR Agriculture Victoria do a lot of work in that space to do with regulations. So it's probably a question that could be directed to them.
And that was the only question that we had in the chat today.
All right.
Got time to move over to the next presenter.
We do indeed. Okay. Well, thank you, Bianca. It was great to get those tips on how to take better photos. And it really isn't that difficult once you get familiar with your mobile phone or your other device to take better photos. Just learning how to tap and focus and so on can really make a big difference. And just being aware of where your shadow is just helps us to help you when you send them to us or others to help you with the ID. Now, when I was a kid, one of the places that I used to visit regularly with my mum, who was a very keen bird watcher, was bushland near Anglesea down on the south coast of Victoria. And my mum used to teach me all about the wildflowers, which is where I got my love for the environment. And she also taught me about bone seed in particular, a weed, and how to pull out the seedlings. And from that interest, I studied horticulture and have had a career over 30 years in weeds. So that love of the environment has stuck with me since childhood. And I'm so glad that the management of that area that I learned to love as a child is in the capable hands within the Otway Eden. And it's great to have Dale Fuller from Parks Victoria this morning with us talking about weed distribution recording in the Otway Eden. Over to you, Dale.
Thanks, Kate. I'll just try and turn that on. There it is. Can you see the slideshow now?
Yes, we can.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Otway Eden, a weed management project that's been in operation since 2004, right across the Otways, where mainly in public land, Great Otway National Park, Otway Forest Park, and other reserves. And looking at the second slide here, it's basically funded through the Victorian government as part of the Weeds and Pest on Public Land program. Otway Eden, is split, has asset areas, high biodiversity asset areas that are established to help focus, I suppose, the control effort. And so there's weed control right throughout the area, but when you're setting priorities, we're looking at those biodiversity asset areas initially as well. And so the project delivers as a risk asset prioritisation approach, and so it looks at new and emerging weeds in the biodiversity asset areas as well as across the entire landscape, as well as high risk established weeds in both areas, and looks at basically the infestations. Are they controllable, or are we basically trying to limit the spread of a species, or actually trying to reduce the infestation? So it's pretty obvious that we need to record where the weed species are and try and have a bit of an idea about the size of the infestations. And so originally in 2004, when the first, I suppose, coordinated response happened and gathering of data and so on, it was pretty much your GPS, your spreadsheet, and there was initially sort of well over sort of 1,500 sites, if not a little bit more, and it's, you know, hasn't gotten any less since. And so in relation to a spreadsheet, it's still quite a robust, I suppose, system. Most people have it. Most people can utilise a spreadsheet. Has its limitations in relation to it's quite intensive to keep the records up to date and quite intensive to basically try and keep track of what the true copy, you know, the final main copy is. And if you've got multiple agencies, which Eden is, you know, it's a partnership of DELP and Parks Victoria, and then you know, we work with other agencies and so on across the area. It's quite difficult to keep what the final version is. It's mainly been point data that you can put in, but at least it's there. At least you can download the data at any time and adapt it across or convert it across to use with your ArcGIS or MapInfo or whatever else. And so there's still some of our staff who still secretly keep a spreadsheet in the background just so that, you know, that they know that there's something that's quite fail-safe, I suppose, that goes with that. What the last couple of years we've been moving further into collector app, and so we have an Otway Weeds collector app. That's through ArcGIS, and basically it's set up a project. You know, we have our spatial people do that, and you can basically either use an iPad, a smartphone, out in the field and record the data. It could be a point or a polygon or a line that you're recording. And in relation to, it's handy, you know, places in the Otways you don't have phone reception and so on. You basically beforehand, you download the data, the maps onto the device, and you can then work remotely offline, and then when you come back in, you sync the iPad and so on to download the data and get it on there. The collector app then helps, you know, hopefully standardise the information, and so you can see on the picture some of the basic information that looks, you know, when we just click for a weed point in relation to area, but you can adapt obviously any of the fields to what suits you. In our case, we have to work with Science and Management Effectiveness branch and try and work in with DELP and other programs, so we have reasonably standard information we're trying to collect. When you want to export the data and try and make use of it and try and help in relation to planning, in relation to collector app, yeah, you can export to a shapefile. For us, that's handy. An Excel spreadsheet, again, for things like downloading into VBA. You can have a geodatabase you can convert across to, and another number of other formats that, yeah, I'm probably not the best person to talk to about that, but there's a fair bit of flexibility basically to download the data. There's plenty of things that still frustrating us. It's still working through in relation to we've combined weed site data and control actions in the same area, and that can be handy, but can be a little bit clunky when you're trying to download the data and you're trying to, say, export the data to another site or to another program. And so we'll look at that. Some other weed control programs, I know, they'll collect data on an annual basis and literally treat, you know, where the sites, check the sites on an annual basis, and then literally undertake actions, have the weeds prioritised and so on, and then literally record all that, have that for posterity, and then start all again the next year. Whereas we're trying to create a more historical site, I suppose, and build on that data from there. It's still issues that different people don't necessarily talk to each other in relation to some of the corporate systems, and so there's still that process where we're getting better, but some of the information that's being asked to get loaded into certain systems doesn't quite necessarily translate across, and so it takes a bit more effort sometimes than what's required. In relation to recording plant site data or weed data, yes, as Goldie had mentioned earlier on, VBA Go or through the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, you can literally do that through on the mobile phone, and especially handy for small weed sites, your early invader weeds and areas like that, and recording those and helping sort of paint the picture. In relation to our program, we have started doing sort of bulk uploads as well, where if we do weed surveys, which we do, things like 1 hectare sites, we'll check randomly in areas right across the Otways, where it's recording all the weed species and so on, and doing incidental site recording as well for weeds. That there's a process through the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas to allow you basically load the data on a spreadsheet and do that bulk upload. In relation to who can collect the data, well, it's pretty obvious anyone can, and we're keen for people, as much information as we have on weed sites, where they are in weeds and so on, can make a big difference. And so in the Otways, we have volunteers, we have groups like Angare, we have a number of individuals that are quite keen. We will do have displays at markets and that sort of stuff to try and encourage people, if there's sites on private property and that sort of thing, to try and make sure we have a bit of an understanding of what's going on across tenure as much as we can. Identifying the species, like Kate and Goldie had said earlier on, is crucial. There's a whole range of different ways of getting that. A number of our local volunteers are very good in relation to species identification, and some of those people have been active, in our case in the Otways, for decades, and so quite regularly are holders of some of that knowledge that it's worthwhile sort of taking note of and actually utilising when possible. Local council, in our case again, someone like the Surf Coast Shire, they have quite a detailed weeds of the Otways or weeds of Surf Coast Shire, and very handy in relation to flora of Victoria. If you're keen, you can key things out, and then as a final sort of arbitrator, we have at times taken samples and sent them off to the National Herbarium in Victoria to get that identification, to try and make sure that we know what the species is, what's going on, so we can actually, with some degree of certainty, work through what we need to do. And in relation to the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, some people would sort of say, well, why press the point about the VBA? What we've been finding is, and I didn't realise initially, I suppose I thought the VBA was more for your rare and threatened species and your native species or indigenous species to an area, recording those and trying to record diversity. And that's true, but at the same time, we need as much information as possible about weed species and where they are, so that there can be informed decisions made. So the VBA feeds through into things like the nature print, and which is another DELP sort of, I suppose, program, and that sort of feeds through to the things like it gives information like strategic biodiversity values, like this slide here. It's basically showing the darker green is where the highest values are in relation to, in this case, the Otways. So what that then means is they'll look at strategic management prospects and look at, again, where the high biodiversity value areas are that need protecting. And in this case, it's sort of showing, the example is the back of Anglesey. It's control of predators, large herbivores and weeds would be the most effective actions to undertake. And so what that means is, with this next slide, is basically there's examples in here in relation to it saying strategic management prospects, what's the threats, benefit and cost of action. And so in this case, threat from transformer weeds. In the Otways, it's pretty much showing that there's not much of a threat from transformer weeds, or that's how I interpret it. And when we asked the question, when we start looking at this data that started coming through in the Nature Kit version 2, we start to realise, well, okay, there may not be as much weed data that's in areas like the VBA, and the onus or the responsibility, I suppose, is on us to actually make sure that there is weed data that's put on there that we have. So some of our surveys, incidental reporting, all of those things, it's in the best value for the land that we're managing, to make sure we're painting that picture of what the threats are, including what the values are as well. And so that when there's things like opportunities to seek funding and that sort of thing, they're not looking at the Otways and making assessments in our case on those values that probably don't have a full picture painted. And so yeah, there's a number of programs where we're sort of, okay, we need to do some of those bulk uploads. And the example is, if our staff are find new and emerging sites and new and emerging species, they don't just go and spray them, rip them out and say, job done. It needs to be recorded. We need to know the extent of it and try and better establish and be better informed about the threat. So yeah, that's about it. Thanks, Kate. Hello.
Thanks, Dale. That was good. A good outline of the Eden project, and yeah, the tools that you're using, and really great point about getting the data into the VBA and that filtering through into things like strategic management prospects and how important that is for funding. I've got a question here asking, does the data get audited often, and can you request additional data from partner agencies where there are gaps? So that's a two-part question.
It depends where you look. The data that gets loaded onto the VBA, there is someone that's their role to actually go and I suppose check the data and check for validity of the data that gets loaded on. So there's a process there. In relation to sort of local programs, it's a continual process, I suppose, in relation to gathering the data. And I suppose Otway Eden was last. It was a version of auditing, it's probably about 8 or 9 years ago, where it was basically, okay, what are the identified species, went right out to all the different organisations, and then basically, you know, went back over everything. What are the threats? What are the weeds of value, and so on. And so that was a good exercise they did at the time. And I suppose our version of auditing, to a degree, because there is that question around, are we being effective with our weed control program? Are we actually getting the weeds? Are we actually helping protect the biodiversity assets? And that can be a difficult question to answer. The Weeds and Pest and Public Land program has a couple of different levels of monitoring, and some of those is you monitor the biodiversity, including the weeds, and that's quite intensive and quite costly, I suppose, to undertake that. And we do that, you know, to a degree on some of the projects. Other areas in relation to the last lot of monitoring, and we'll probably do it again this year, are literally your 1 hectare plots. There's about 500 across the Otways. They were done in 2010 and 11, and we did most of it in 2019-20, and we've got another one of the asset areas to do again this year. that starts to paint a picture, as in the occurrence. Are we finding weeds in further areas? What weeds are we finding, and where? And they'll do incidental monitoring in between the sites as well, so you start to get pretty good coverage. And so we working with other agencies, obviously like DELP, and that we have a project working group. We're always quite keen, we try and any new species and any new areas we try and we include them in the program, include them into the sites, and it's the main thing is talking, communicating, and trying to work together. And we don't always do it perfectly, but the aim is to keep sort of working at it. In our case, ones like Vic Roads or Regional Roads Victoria, the local councils, there's a whole range of other authorities and people, as well as private property that we have to try and work with, otherwise we won't be effective as a weed program.
Sure. And one of the other questions is, how do you encourage people to get weed records out of notebooks and spreadsheets and into corporate data or spatial systems? So some of those partner agencies and stakeholders that you mentioned, like Angare, how are you getting them to enter their data? Is that something you help them with, or is it something that you're guiding them through?
Look, we encourage that. It's weeds and it's rare and threatened species. There's more than one occasion when we've had someone from a local organisation or someone locally that said, you're impacting on this particular species. It's actually a Victorian rare or threatened species, or listed as such. And quite regularly the answer is, well, okay, we didn't even know about that. We need to get your information and make sure it's posted on there. One of our local staff with DELP, I know Rani just had a training session with local Angare group in relation to VBA and loading data and loading bits and pieces on there. So there's encouragement that way, and that's part of it. When we have we try and do sessions in areas, in our case across the Otways, where we're trying to focus people on what we think are priority weeds, and we still try and promote things like VBA Go and those sorts of things. And but it's a continual process. People come, people go, and yes, there's people that have that data and they do hold on to it, but generally, or at least locally, we try and they're pretty good about handing that data over if they've got the GPS coordinates and that sort of thing. And generally, if it's a spreadsheet, it can be converted, or we can download waypoints and that sort of thing, and so on. So yeah, it's a continual process.
Yep. Great to hear. And that's all we've got time for, so I'll hand back over to Kate.
Thank you. Thanks, Dale, and thanks, Bianca. Dale, really interesting just to hear how you're managing those thousands of distribution records around the Otway Eden. Thanks for sharing all your information. We're just going to interrupt the program momentarily for a message from Andrew Cox, the CEO from the Invasive Species Council. Andrew, I invite you to turn your camera and microphone on. You should be able to join us now. Over to you.
Thanks, Kate. You can hear me, can you?
I can, thank you.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'm here today. It's a great honour. Every year we announce the winners of our Froggatt Awards, and the Froggatt Awards are in honour of the entomologist who tried to stop the cane toad being released in Australia in the 1930s. As we all know, he was unsuccessful, but the Froggatt Awards are to honour efforts in tackling invasive species across Australia, efforts which are heroic, efforts which are well thought through, efforts which have been running for quite a while but maybe haven't been well recognised. So it's my great honour this morning to announce that we're giving one of our 3 Froggatt Awards this year to the WESI programs, the Weeds of Early Stages of Invasion. So congratulations, team.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew.
So I just want to honour particularly the 3 team members that drove this in the initial stages, Kate, of course, and Beck James, and now Bianca. So thank you, team. Thanks for the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning for supporting the program. And look, you'll get in the mail a certificate. This is one of last year's ones, but we'll post this to you. And so hopefully I can do it in person if I line some things up for you. And I guess what's great about the Weeds of Early Stages of Invasion project is it allows resources to be efficiently directed when responding to new weed threats. And I think it could be applied to all of Australia. So maybe that's the future for you guys to have a WESI program in every state of Australia. So congratulations.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Much appreciated, and thank you to the Invasive Species Council. That's a real thrill. Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us this morning, Andrew.
Good on you. All right, thank you.
Fantastic. Wow, what a blast. Okay, well, that's a lovely interruption indeed. Now, continuing on with our program, I'm so pleased to have our final speaker for the webinar series with us today. Randall Robinson was a big early career influencer for me, along with a friend and colleague he is acknowledging today. It's so important to have positive mentors during a career, and I know Randall continues to influence many, especially through his role as Associate Professor at Victoria University. Randall's talking today about the critical and often overlooked step in a weed management process, and that is delimiting. Delimiting, many people have never heard of the word before or are very confused about it. And it's really a very simple but so essential part in the weed management process. It's all about working out the boundaries of an infestation before you start treating, so you don't spend millions or hundreds or thousands of dollars treating something that isn't actually appropriate. Bianca and I have seen so many examples of people spending thousands on contractors and so on to treat an infestation, and then they walk over the next ridgeline and see they've got hectares of it, and that little investment that they could have spent more wisely has been essentially wasted. So I'm also really glad today that Randall is acknowledging Darcy Duggan, who passed away recently. Darcy was a larger-than-life personality and a passionate advocate for nature. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Associate Professor Randall Robinson to speak on the Darcy Duggan Memorial Lecture about search and detect for weeds, the importance of working out how much you have before starting treatment. Over to you, Randall.
Thank you, Kate, and congratulations to the team for your wonderful achievement there.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let me get to my, okay, that should come up.
Yes, we can see your presentation. Thanks, Randall.
Okay, great. Okay, I'd just like to start out today. Hopefully I got that one correct. Is recognizing my long-term friend, Darcy Duggan. I met Darcy literally within an hour of getting off the airplane to migrate here. And we went to a conference in Melbourne called the EDGE Conference, which was about environmental weeds and that boundary between urban and rural and those kind of things. Darcy did pass away just recently, but he was such a wonderful contributor to restoration ecology, particularly in management. And as you can see on the left-hand side, it's just a little group of like-minded souls. You can see Graham Larimer in the middle, Jeff Ugovic, Gija, Damien Cook, David Cameron, Neville Walsh, Doug Frood, just luminaries in this field. And we all have worked for, well, over 40 years now in this field, trying to get things done. And Darcy really impressed on me over the years. He and I have worked on with Greening Australia and the National Trust, on developing the habitat conservation and management course that's now run for 30 years. This year it didn't run. And over those years, we've worked out some common sense things that work in the field. So I thought I'd share some of those with you today. So two things that commonly come up is the importance of correct identification and planning. And it fascinates me how quickly people identify something as a weed or not a weed and just get on with controlling. And it's really important that we don't do that. We don't get tempted by that. Because if we know what we're dealing with, we can then start to work out what method we should use for control. So most people will know systems ecology, which is called synecology. Then there's the ecology of the individual species, knowing the life cycles. And it is massively important that we know the life cycles of these plants, particularly from their germination requirements right through to their full life cycle and death. One of the things that Darcy talked a lot about during all this time is that although we're dealing with weeds individually, weeds are not necessarily the main focus of our work. The main focus of our work is a whole of ecosystem approach. The reason we're getting rid of the weeds is that we can have healthy ecosystems. So to achieve that, we need to do the best we can. I'll skip around a little bit here. One of the basic fundamentals of ecology is that resources are limited. And that applies to finances and programs and those kind of things as well. So we have to be extremely clever in how we go about controlling various weeds, but also how we plan for various things. In my role as the director of the Institute for Sustainable Industries and Livable Cities, it's my role to look at sustainability of the various things that we do. And pacing and timing work, but also targeting and scheduling our interventions is exceedingly important. You will have seen and probably work with multiple of these weed information packs. This is just one from New South Wales. Nearly every local government area has one of these by now, at least in Victoria, and they come in really handy to help us through the year and help us time our work well. After fire, this is a picture of King Lake after the 2009 fires. And one of the things I've worked with over the years, I did an article about 30 years ago on oxalis, but what it came down to and really impressed on me is that there's a thing called point sources of infection. And from those spots, plants spread, fairly straightforward. A good example of that was at Anglesey after the fires in the early 80s. Plants that we didn't know were weeds, like Hakea suaveolens, or I guess that's now Grevillea suaveolens, was not a weed before those fires. It was the occasional plant that came up, but after the fires, the seed released by the fires completely obliterated most of a large part of the heath along the main roads there. So looking at those point sources, particularly looking at corridors where we might find new invasions or exploding invasions, and particularly adjacent to parks and gardens where there's potential new sources of infections and dump areas. For many years, and Kate mentioned Graham Lorimer, but for many years, there's been a real desire to make sure that we get the identification correct. There's quite a few species in Victoria that may look like a weed species, but they're native. And this is just one example, Osteospermum dipoides, coast tussock grass. To someone at a casual glance, it could easily be mistaken, even though it's a little bit bigger. But there's other species that are less clear for a lot of people. This is on the left is Gladiolus variety pubescens, which is actually quite a limited plant in Victoria, native plant in Victoria, and without its flowers on, can easily be mistaken for Cape Broom, and is mistaken for Cape Broom. In the Dandenongs, when control measures for Cape Broom were being implemented, large swathes of Gudia got wiped out in the process, just through mistaken identity. Another one that I learned about recently was Symbinotus lawsonianus, little bear's claw that occurs down at Melton, being mistaken for capeweed. It just looks like a scrawny version of capeweed. And it's quite a shame to see some of our rare and threatened species being accidentally wiped out. But after fire, it's a particularly difficult period because we don't necessarily have flowers to rely on. So we have to look at other ways of doing things. Unfortunately, good pictures of weeds are, as Bianca has pointed out, are hard to come by. But good pictures of non-flowering or seedlings of weeds are even more difficult. So agriculture departments tend to do a little bit better in putting out booklets and identification guides. This is just one from New South Wales on seedlings in temperate crops. But what can we do? Starting out with a list of plants that are in our areas is a good start, but we need to move on from that. Dale mentioned relying on some of the local groups. You'd be amazed how, and most of you would, who are participate in this would know that some of the local groups have an enormous amount of knowledge that you can call on to help you out. And even in the social media, there's various online Facebook groups where you can post hopefully a good picture of your weed, and people will help you out with identification or fight about it, whatever the case may be. So there's been a bit of discussion of how we map, so I won't go into much more and cover what Dale's already done. But one of the things for us, I think it's really important, and this Dale did make this point quite clearly, is that we should, as best as possible, work in with existing databases so that the information that we collect and spend the energy on collecting can be used by future workers in the field or generations, and that everyone has access to it. Points and polygons, that's been discussed, also grids. One of the things that hasn't come up here is intensity. So how dense is a population or not dense? On the right-hand side is a picture of some plots from the Gippsland Lakes from my PhD on Melaleuca. And what's fascinating there is that you can see those circled areas are individual plants that are up to 45 meters across. And as you go north in the photograph, you see much smaller plants. So density, distribution, things like that are really, really important. But some of this can be done by remote sensing. So aerial photographs, and you can develop up layers. And it's interesting to see Dale still holding on to the spreadsheets. I still hold on to the spreadsheets in the original quadrats as well. But methods over the 40 years I've been playing around in this have evolved tremendously. And I think it's just amazing that we can take our iPhones out into the field and start collecting data. But most importantly, whatever method we do use for collecting data is that it's tailored to what it's going to be used for. So I'll just include this next one. So I've already mentioned about population density, size, and distribution. And there's tons of systems to deal with this. The National Trust of New South Wales has a 4-tier system, color-coded system based on density of population, weed population, and that's what's been used in the four illustrations on the bottom left. And that's a tracking of Ehrharta over a period of management of 4 years, 5 years. And you can see the change in population over that time, the green representing good, the red representing the heaviest infestations. So you can plan, but also look at how you target those actions. And it really allows for the prioritizing and maximizing of resource use, because resources are always at a premium. And most of all, and this brings up the question of, are we actually being successful? Are we achieving our goals? And that's exceedingly important. And I just wanted to bring one thing up. So Kate was mentioning delimiting populations. And most of our work hopefully will be based on ecological thought and ecological processes. And I commonly bring this up in our management classes about using the processes of extinction to help us conceptualize how we deal with population management of weeds. So we're really good at extinction. Australia's got the highest rate of extinctions in the world, so we obviously have some propensity to be able to understand this concept. So when we're trying to understand how we would map, is that we look at the overall population. You'll have dense bits, mature areas, and moving out from that central area, you'll find smaller and smaller populations until you get to individuals. So putting a boundary around that, looking at the density, looking at the distribution. And the main principle to play with here is fragmenting populations. So taking a regular pattern, making it a random pattern, making it into a patchy pattern, and eventually taking out those small patches in individuals. And it can be done. So I just want to leave that thought in your mind. And hopefully I'm not too far over. But one of the things that I just wanted to leave on was that we really consider using ecological processes, understanding those processes, and planning. One of the principles that Darcy used to talk about when it got to the technique section, he just put planning 5 times in a row. His idea was that you go to an area, you wander around, have a cup of tea, in his case, have a smoke, and look around and size it all up and keep going out until you get a good understanding of it, spend time on it, and take the smallest action you can get to get the biggest outcome. But with all of this, the recording helps us in the first instance, follow-up recordings after that to see how we're going, and just ongoing vigilance into the future. And that's about me.
Thanks, Randall. Really good points to take away when identifying weeds there, and I especially appreciated the similarities between the native species and the lookalike weeds, or
Yep.
the weeds and the lookalike natives, whichever way around you want to look at it. And the really important message is about planning too. So a couple of questions.
Yep.
As you reflect on the work you have done with Darcy on the Habitat Conservation and Management course over the many years, what do you think will be the most important legacy of the course?
I think that the fact that over that period of time, we've had close to 900 people go through the course. And I think nearly every shire or local council area in Melbourne, and now quite a few others outside of Melbourne, have people who have been through our course. So they base their, hopefully, if we've influenced them positively, they'll base their decision-making on long-term planning and ecological thought.
Fantastic. What an amazing effort, 900 people. There's another one. What would you like people nearing retirement to think about their own legacy?
Oh, goodness. Wow. I hadn't thought about that. Is someone implying that I'm about to retire?
Oh.
No, that's fine. I have been actually considering that. I think one of the thing that I would like to see as a legacy, maybe for myself, and if other people want to take this up, that's great. After I started teaching, I have an accent. So certain words come out of me that aren't normal in the Australian vernacular. And down the track, I would hear my words coming back to me from someone else that hadn't done my course. And I always took that as a compliment because my message was getting through. And if nothing else, I would like to imbue people with an enthusiasm for understanding plants and environments as a whole, and being the warriors of the future.
Nice. And did you want to share some of your favourite memories that you have of Darcy in the field, and any of his words that he used to use or sayings that you might like to share with people?
Darcy was really good at creating word pictures. So he would convey things by putting a picture in your mind of what he was trying to get across. So he didn't use lingo a lot, or jargon. And he would, you didn't have to go to the spot to understand what it looked like and how it functioned. So it's been 15 years since I've been to Mumble Creek, where he's done amazing management there. But he could describe to me what was happening in that field. And I think that's a particular skill to doing that.
Definitely an amazing talent.
I could tell you a not so nice story, but that's
maybe in the debrief afterwards.
Yeah.
And there's a funny one here that says, has your understanding of biodiversity and potentially unwanted growth enabled you to grow such an impressive beard?
Oh, this is short, actually. It used to be much longer. Yeah. Kate can attest. She knows what it looked like 40 years ago. Very good.
And speaking of Kate, I might hand back over to Kate, and she can make some closing comments.
That's awesome. Thank you, Randall. I really liked your presentation and hearing your memories also about Darcy. He was truly inspiring guy. And sorry about the question about retirement. I wasn't trying to put you on the spot at all. Randall, just also you mentioned yesterday leading up to the webinar that there's clearly a link between you and the Otway Eden. You had some involvement in the early days of the Eden, if you wanted to talk briefly about that.
Yeah, as you know, Kate, I used to work for the Department of, it started out as Conservation, Forests and Lands and went through the constant name change department. But in 1985, I think it was, myself and David Cameron and a few others worked on the Rainforest Project down in the Otways, partly down in the Otways, mostly in East Gippsland as well. And further on from that, I got involved in various programs, and part of that involved getting information out of Dale for some survey work we were doing down there in 2004, I think it was.
So this century, not last.
Yeah. Yeah, very well.
Well, thanks, Randall. Really appreciate you joining us today and your presentation. Thank you. I'm wearing a bit of vintage myself today, an old Weed Buster badge from the good old days of the Weed Buster program. Well, that's a wrap for our 4-part webinar series. So grateful for all the collaborators who've participated and all the support people who've helped make this happen, particularly with the technology and promotion of the webinar. It's been an absolute pleasure bringing the series to you. We hope that it's filled you with ideas and inspiration about what's possible, new tech and information that you perhaps have not heard of before, and give you a base to keep building on and growing your own skills and knowledge. We want to thank our speakers across today and also the whole series. Our audience, thank you for joining us, our support team, collaborators, as I've mentioned. We'd really love your evaluation about today's webinar. We'll put a link in the chat. It'd be great to get some feedback from you. Just a reminder that the recordings from the whole series are available on the Swift website. The one for today and all the links in the chat will be there in coming days. Wow, what a year it's been. We hope that you have a fabulous and safe festive season and summer. Enjoy a well-earned break if you can. And from Bianca Gold and myself and our collaborators, we'd like to thank you for joining us today and through the series, and stay safe. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. See ya.